Summary of Flexion by Cate Kennedy. Sheep farmer Frank Slovak gets hurt badly when his tractor flips over and pins him under it. People in the town talk about the accident. They say that Frank's shy wife, Mrs. Slovak, was the one who found him, and they try to think how scared they would be in her place. On the day of the accident, Mrs. Slovak comes home from the store and finds the tractor on its side on the farm. When she gets to the field by running across the paddocks, she finds Frank crushed under the big machine. After she turns off the tractor, Mrs. Slovak tells Frank she's going to run and call for help. When Frank closes his eyes instead of yelling at her, she knows he's hurt badly. Frank's face looks sad, and Mrs. Slovak thinks that all the feelings he's kept from her for the past 18 years are now showing. Mrs. Slovak needs 15 minutes to run to the house, call an ambulance, and run back. After Frank has been in the hospital for more than a week, people still talk about him. Most people agree that Frank's life is pretty much over. He's always been a man with a hot temper and a strong desire to work hard. Frank is now partly disabled and probably won't be able to do the things he used to do again, though no one in town knows exactly what his injuries are. When people look at Mrs. Slovak with pity in public and leave food and gifts at the Slovak store, Mrs. Slovak gets angry. Frank made her keep quiet about her miscarriage years ago, so she never got this kind of help from the community. Frank was sure that they should move on from the loss, but Mrs. Slovak feels haunted and heavy because of it. Soon, Frank gets a very bad case of asthma while he is in the hospital getting better from his accident. Mrs. Slovak thinks that Frank's illness must be like drowning when she hears him fight to breathe. She thinks it must be a relief for him to finally die from it. Mrs. Slovak is surprised at how easy it is for her to think of Frank in the past tense. Given the outlook for his injuries, Mrs. Slovak thinks that death is the best thing that could happen to Frank. She starts making up stories about Frank dying, like telling the doctor to turn off his life support, telling other people, and holding a small funeral. But Frank gets better from his bronchitis, which makes Mrs. Slovak sad. The doctors are even hopeful that he'll be able to move again. Mrs. Slovak acts happy, but she is really angry as she watches Frank stubbornly try to learn how to feed himself again. When the doctor leaves the room, Frank slaps Mrs. Slovak's hand out of the way when she goes to wipe his mouth. This is typical of Frank, Mrs. Slovak thinks. As Frank gets worse over the next few weeks, Mrs. Slovak hopes that he will no longer be able to take care of the farm and that they will have to move to a house in town. Mrs. Slovak thinks she might be able to buy a new car with the money from the insurance payout, the sale of the farm, and the caretaker's salary she hopes to get. Men from around the town show up to fix Frank's tractor and take the Slovak's lambs to market. One day, Frank does better in physical therapy than the doctors thought he would and is able to stand up and take a step. Mrs. Slovak keeps pretending to be grateful for Frank's changes, but she really hates him. When Mrs. Slovak got home that afternoon, she found a local plumber there. He had put in a shower and sink for the Slovaks that were easy for people with disabilities to use. He did this for free. He also tells Mrs. Slovak that Frank's hay will be baled by another farmer. Again, Mrs. Slovak acts like she's grateful, but she's really angry. She knows that this is going to be her new normal, acting happy that Frank is better while he bosses her around and yells at her. Mrs. Slovak thinks that Frank won't mind not being able to move around much because he doesn't show any feelings toward her. Frank moans about how much the new bathroom and wheelchair ramp cost when he gets home from the hospital. Mrs. Slovak tells him that the changes were made for free. Frank pushes her away and goes outside to look at the nicely stacked bales of hay in the shed. Mrs. Slovak imagines Frank falling to the ground and lying there, curled up and sad, which is so different from the Frank she knows. When Frank comes inside, Mrs. Slovak helps him take a shower. She sees how old and weak his body looks and says something to him about it. Frank is rude and angry when Mrs. Slovak tells him what to do, but when she helps him change the temperature of the water, she can tell he wants to thank her. She thinks this is the longest talk they've had with each other in months. After Frank takes a shower, Mrs. Slovak shaves and cuts his hair. Then she gives him the phone and a list of all the people who helped them while Frank was in the hospital. She tells him to thank each one of these people by phone. When Frank says no, Mrs. Slovak tells him that they will need favors now if they want to keep the farm from going bankrupt. She notices again how sad Frank looks. Mrs. Slovak turns the mirror she used to cut his hair toward him and tells him to look at himself and make the calls. That night, as Mrs. Slovak and Frank lie in bed next to each other, Mrs. Slovak thinks about the flexion movements Frank did in the hospital with a physical therapist. The movements, which involved repeatedly bending and straightening different joints, were meant to help the muscles remember how to move and stop them from weakening. Mrs. Slovak sees all of a sudden that Frank is crying quietly next to her. She's never seen Frank like this before, so she decides not to help him so he doesn't feel embarrassed. Then, Frank tells Mrs. Slovak that he wanted to die while she ran to call an ambulance. He says that was the best gift he could have given her. Mrs. Slovak thinks about the day of the accident and thinks she knows how Frank feels. She knows what it's like to be paralyzed, useless, and hurt. Mrs. Slovak walks over to Frank and gently takes his hand in hers. She lifts their arms and bends their elbows together, then puts Frank's hand over his own heart and holds it there.
About the author. Cate Kennedy was born in England in 1963. During her childhood, she moved around with her parents, living in different parts of England until they finally settled in Australia. She got her bachelor's degree from the University of Canberra and has since taught writing at more than one university. Kennedy also worked as a community arts organizer in Victoria, Australia, and spent 2 years in the 1990s teaching adult reading in Mexico with Australian Volunteers International. Kennedy wrote the award-winning book The World Beneath and a number of collections of poems and short stories, such as Like a House on Fire, in which the story Flexion is included. Her short stories have also been published in The New Yorker and Harvard Review, among other places. Kennedy has won a number of literary awards, such as the Stella Prize, the Age Short Story Award, and the NSW Premier's People's Choice Award. She lives in Victoria right now.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.